we haven't done anything yet. Good evening and welcome to the Butler University Seminar on Religion and Global Affairs. This year focusing on the theme of sacred places, intersections of religion and ecology. My name is Daniel Myers. I'm the director of the Center for Faith and Vocation here at Butler University. We're always excited about every seminar event we're able to do and able to produce. We have no favorites, they're all our favorite, but I will say that tonight is of particular excitement with some particular anticipation. As we imagined a seminar series on the intersections of religion and ecology, we knew that climate change would always be at the center of the conversation, if not the periphery. Tonight's title is Global Religious Perspectives on Climate Change, and we're taking the bull by the horns on this major issue that affects all of us in this time. We're excited to hear how our speakers tonight engage climate change through the lenses of East Asian traditions, Judaism, and Hinduism. So we're in for a treat to hear a lot of different voices and perspectives about something critically important. I want to offer a few sincere notes of gratitude to our partners. We want to thank the Global and Historical Studies here at Butler, as well as the Episcopal and Lutheran Campus Ministry Grace Unlimited, both of whom are sponsors for tonight. I also want to thank some of our colleagues over at the Center for Urban Ecology and Science, Technology, and Environmental Studies program. They helped us think through this series, and we're grateful for their conversation. And thank you, as always, to the Philosophy, Religion, and Classics department here at Butler, who every year dedicates a scholar to be our faculty director, this year being no different. And allow me just a moment to introduce who that director is. Dr. Brent Heggie will say just a few more notes about our upcoming speaker, but before he comes, let me just say a note about him. Dr. Heggie is an instructor of religion in addition to being the Center for Faith and Vocation Scholar in Residence. He earned his PhD in theology with distinction from Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. He teaches a variety of courses here at Butler, one of which is eco-theology, which was the seed to this particular seminar series. Dr. Heggie has brought a wonderful blend of intellectual curiosity, expertise, and pragmatic thinking to pulling this seminar together, for which we're very grateful. As we prepare to hear more about our keynote, please join me in welcoming Dr. Heggie to the stage.
Thank you, Daniel. Good evening, everyone. Let me also add my welcome to all of you to this third session of this year's Butler Seminar on Religion and Global Affairs. We're pleased to welcome you all to Butler. We're excited to hear from our three speakers about resources in several religious traditions for addressing the climate change crisis. So to get right to it, our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Gia Sophia Oh, is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Westchester University outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she teaches courses on religion and ecology, environmental ethics, Asian philosophy, and comparative religions. She is the section chair of comparative religion and ecology, and also of religion, gender, and sexuality at the Mid-Atlantic region of the American Academy of Religion, and a member of the leadership team of the Women's Caucus of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature. In 2017, she co-edited Nature's Transcendence and Immanence, a comparative interdisciplinary ecstatic naturalism. And in her 2011 book, A Post-Colonial Theology of Life, Planetarity East and West, is the first work to bridge post-colonialism, eco-theology, and Asian spirituality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gia Sophia Oh.
Thank you, Dr. Haggis. Thank you, everyone, for coming in this venue event in this inclement weather. And I'm so honored and happy to present my work and share my unique contextual theology and ecology with Butler community. My work is Yes. Eastern learning, which is called Donghak in Korean, as an indigenous tradition and kind of a theological movement in the late 19th century when the external colonization by Western world and Japan. And also there was internal kind of corruption of aristocracy in Korea. Donghak was actually initiated by the scholar called Suun, who combined kind of life-oriented theories from three major Asian traditions: reverence from Confucianism, also non-doing or doing non-doing, non-acting from Taoism, and also Buri, that means non-dualism from Buddhism, as well as Christianity, like oneness of God and Christianity, and also life-oriented Korean shamanism as well. So I'm going to introduce Donghak today and share with you some constructive and life-oriented concept in Donghak, with comparing with Whitedian aspect of life as capital L. Okay, so I want to share with you first when it's a kind of conversation between Suun and his disciple, and his disciple asked, "Do you study Buddhism?" "I like Buddhism." "Why did you not become a monk?" Understanding the Buddhist principles without having to become a monk would be better. Then, are you Confucian? "I like Confucianism, but I'm not Confucian." "Well, then, are you Taoist?" "I like Taoism, but I'm not Taoist." "What do you mean exactly?" "Who are you then?" Right? What do you like best among those? You have two hands. Do you have to like one more than the other? "Now I understand. You mean you like the whole body, don't you?" "I'm neither Buddhist nor Confucian nor Taoist. Still, I love all of the principles, for there is no place where heavenly way, Tian Dao, does not reach." So I start with Hanul, the divine multiplicity and one and many. This is Donghak's incantation, 시천주 조화정 영세불망만사지, which means if one embodies Hanul, one will be creatively transformed. If one never forgets Hanul, one will be knowing the mystery of everything. This passage is known as the incantation of Donghak. Founded by Suun, his teaching is condensed into these 13 Chinese characters. Suun taught his followers to repeat and recite the 13 words of incantation and subsequently interpreted each word. Yet he never attempted to explain the word Hanul, the divine, in Chinese character Tian. For Suun, Hanul is the word that represents ultimate reality. However, Suun chose not to define Hanul. Rather, he opened an interstitial space for the word as a mystery. Hyodong Lee, a comparative theologian and Donghak scholar, explains that it's Suun's apophatic sensibility about heaven, an attitude of awe, reverence, and intellectual humility before a transcendent reality, however personal or even anthropomorphic, a form in which heaven is encountered. Hanul is a Korean word. Han means literally a magnificent unity, which includes everything in terms of togetherness. Uri means we in Korean. So Koreans identify themselves not individual person, but person in the community. So they indicate themselves Uri, like means we. So for example, I love banana. Then Koreans said, we love banana. And the funny thing is, they call our husband 우리 남편. That's so kind of impressive, but that means my husband, monogamous, but 우리 husband. That means we, our husband. Okay, that's tricky, but identifying themselves within the community or interconnectedness. The Korean letter Han has no end. The Han 없다, that means there is no end. And means the infinite becoming. That kind of macrocosmic world itself, as holistic togetherness, the entirety of cosmos is Hanul. But that means at the same time yourself. Therefore, Hanul not only means personal God, but also indicates the whole cosmos as one organic body, the whole process of the cosmic life. But Koreans call God Hanulim. Hanul means God. But we call you guys Hanul. That means you are divine. So even a single blade of grass, there is nothing that is not Hanul. So always there is Hanul. So it's more like a pantheistic rather than panentheistic. But there is no distinction between pantheism and deistic distinction, like Western theology says, like pantheism means everything is God and God is everything. Panentheism means God is in everything and everything is in God. That kind of deistic distinction doesn't exist in Korean particular theology of Donghak. As famous Greek phrase, which was echoed by Maestro Eckhart, Nicholas Cusa, Blaise Pascal, Baruch Spinoza, Robin Corrington, and Catherine Keller attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere, whose circumference nowhere. One must understand the Suun's Hanul in his non-dualistic oneness of the cosmos, which includes all subjects as one organic body. Embodying Hanul, Sicheonju, means the interrelated becoming of human beings in heaven, that is, in Hyodong Lee's word, the divinization of human beings and the humanization of heaven. I understand Suun's notion of Hanul and as becoming an extensive as well as expansive organism which endlessly embraces all expression of life, human and non-human, including non-organic bodies. One embraces the other as the whole and vice versa in this spiritual organism or organisms. This oneness of Hanul, including the whole cosmos, is understood as one organic body in the cosmological hybridization, like becoming together with all collective aspects and entities. Suun's Hanul is in the process of the world and actually the becoming in time, not beyond time. As humans are living in time and space, the cosmic life is living and becoming endlessly with humankind as Hanul. Hanul, the cosmic life, is thus living together with every tiny body as one unity. A Donghak scholar, Pyo Yong-sam, also notes Suun's Hanul as becoming the process of the cosmic life existed even before the white alien God in process. As you see, the years they lived were very, very similar kind of period of time. But I bet they never exchange the emails or something, but process and reality. The White has like very classic book was written after Suwon's 동경대전, which means the Great Book of Dongha, Great Book of Eastern Learning. When you hear about Eastern learning, there is very post-colonial term because Suwon encountered Christianity and was mesmerized about the concept of God, but he didn't really follow that because for him it's a colonial kind of concept of God. So he called Christianity Sohak, means Western learning. So somehow like confronting Sohak, Western learning, he called his own theology Donghak, Eastern learning. That's why it's post-colonial. But unlike like liberation theology, although post-colonial is after postmodern kind of theological aspect, but I interpreted Suwon's kind of somehow like independent kind of hybridization of theological activities as post-colonial. The reason is because he didn't really kind of reject all of them, but rather he collected all the goodness from Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and even Christianity and Korean cultural elements in terms of life. So anything life-oriented he collected, just like me. So for Suwon, all movement of living, not only by and through human beings, but also by all different entities, are considered as divine, Hanul. I understand Hanul according to the understanding of Suwon, who pointed out that is both the cosmic life and its embodiment. In this process of life, which Suwon left without any definition, Hanul is feeling and emptying endlessly because Hanul cannot be known without knowing the movement of life, like guarding and selving. Like life is somehow naturing, having the transformative power within nature. That nature is divine, the divinity. Through the endless movement of embracing others, so as to be enlivened together. Korean word 살림 means enlivening. Any sustainable activities are called 살림, but etymologically derived from the woman's household task, like cooking and eating together and nurturing. But 살림, nature, woman, were genderized and inferiorized by the patriarchal and anthropocentric world order, but somehow they are very essential and fundamental for somehow the keeping and maintaining our lives. But 살림's, the broad meaning of 살림 means like sustaining, recycling, reconciling, and reviving, enlivening. So I want to kind of share with you the 살림 aspect, along with the concept of Hanul. So two Korean words. I know it's kind of buzzing, but the Hanul means the divine, but not like ontological transcendental Godhead only, but including that, the whole cosmic entirety within which you are there as Hanul, but it's not like it's not only ontological entity, but it's more like activity. So you're living itself. If you living 살림, like enlivening, that means you're guarding, like a living God, performing goodness. Suwon's notion of Hanul can also be understood as such that the whole organic body, including individual bodies to the smallest individual units, are becoming together. Catherine Keller's word, like intercarnation. Like incarnation means becoming flesh, but intercarnation, becoming together. That is the relationship between the macrocosm and microcosm of Hanul. According to Whitehead, actual entities are the final real things of which the world is made up. There is no going behind the actual entities to find anything more real. An actual entity is not an inert and permanent substance, but a relational process of becoming. How an actual entity becomes constituted what that actual entity is. Its being is constituted by its becoming. That is the principle of process. This process of becoming is also a creative synthesis into one actual entity of its many relations to other actual entities. This process can be also described as continuing on and on. Everything is constantly in the process of synthesizing a vast, diverse past into a subjective, momentary unity. As soon as a new unity is achieved, the new entity contributes itself to the world and becomes one of the many that will be synthesized into a unity in the next moment of experience. In the context of process 동학 dialogue, I can describe Hanul as the infinite becoming of life. Nevertheless, the juxtaposition of Suun's notion of Hanul and the Whiteheadian becoming in process does not mean that the process God and Hanul are identical. For Whitehead, God exists in process and change. God is an active agent for Whitehead by the distinction between the primordial and the consequent nature of God. Whitehead associates God's immanence with the primordial nature as being with all creation, luring it toward beauty by providing potentials in the form of its initial aim. Viewed as primordial, God is the unlimited conceptual realization of potentiality. However, God is not before all creation, but with all creation. Like God is feeling, like God is the poet of the word. From the consequent nature of God, God is the principle of concretion. Whitehead's notion of God's immanence is sharing creation. God shares with every new creation, and the concrescent creature is objectified in God as a novel element in God's objectification of that actual world. Thus, for Whitehead, God is the presupposed actuality of conceptual operation in unison of becoming with every other creative act. In other words, God shares with every new creation its actual world, and the concrescent creature is objectified in God as a novelty in God's objectification of the actual world. Sounds abstract, right? On the other hand, Hanul for Suun is what changes in process. As he identifies working subject as Hanul, in this sense, one can say that Suun is more non-dualistic than Whitehead. In this sense, Hanul as the ultimate is the working God, similar to the Whiteheadian moving whole. Roland Farber describes, quote, "The universe as a moving whole becomes within this unity. A unity emerges as creative novelty out of multiplicity. This unity is relativized into one unity among many in a universe that is precisely and creatively renewed. Whitehead's universe is an ecological process of integration and relativization, a process of processes. The triad structure of one and many through creativity endlessly creates through the process of becoming and perishing, diffusion, and convergence. For Whitehead, the ultimates are one, many, and creativity. But creativity doesn't mean God. But God who doesn't create, then there is no meaning of God, right? So the notion of the Whiteheadian ultimate The God, which Whitehead points out, is the actual entity, therefore a creature transcended by the creativity. For Whitehead, there is no meaning to creativity apart from its creatures, and there is no meaning to God apart from the creativity and the temporal creatures, and no meaning to the temporal creatures apart from creativity and God. So I believe that the God and creativity is like the relationship between God and creativity is like the light and lamp and the wisdom and meditation. Nonetheless, it does not appear that creativity is another name for God, but one can say that God can be God when she creates. David Griffin points out that Whitehead's term creativity provides a new understanding of the previous philosophers' notion of being, design, or being itself. Griffin affirms that the Whiteheadian God is not simply being itself, but the ultimate embodiment of creativity. Thus, the Whiteheadian God is God in action, God in process, therefore a working God in process. The Korean process theologian Kim Kyung-jae also notes that Suun's Hanul is not a transcendental being, but one who is becoming, 생성, which can also be translated as generating or creating. That is, God is revealed in the process of creating, which is God's breath of life. Hanul is the endless becoming of life. In Whiteheadian thinking, God is immanent within all living beings as a lure to live with satisfaction that the process theologian J. McDaniel calls the process of hybridity, the very impulse to live with satisfaction relative to the situation at hand, which lies at the very heart of life, is an ongoing process of hybridizing. McDaniel asserts that process theology offers a cosmological background for considering the more specific type of hybridity with which postcolonial thinkers deal. All of us are already hybrids many times over in the actual living of our lives. We are never simply one thing, but always already many things. We are always already a process of the many become one. So Whitehead said, one becomes intensified by many, and many is generated, many becomes one. It's a plurisingularity according to Catherine Keller. Hybridity of Hanu, the triune reverence of life. Suun's Shichonju, embracing Hanul theology, was highly developed and practiced by Haewol's notion of Yang Chonju, living Hanul, or Goding, or Selving, S-E-L-V-I-N-G, like self-becoming, like Selving, which can be described by three practical approaches: reverence toward the heaven, 경천, reverence toward human beings, 경인, and reverence toward everything, 경물. Only the person who lives Hanul is the person who has embodied Hanul. I understand living Hanul as Goding, G-O-D-D-N-G, or G-O-D-I-N-G, Goding, what Heidegger will call Gatrang, being is trembling of the Goding in his book Mindfulness, is unfolding of the divine mystery of Hanul. The term Goding is used for living the divine, Through it could be used in reference to all diverse religious acts. Then how could we live through the divine according to Haewol? Haewol is the follower of Suun. The answer is reverence, kyung. Treat others as Hanul because they are Hanul. Hayward's golden rule is that everything on the earth, not only other human beings, but also to animals and plants on the earth, and earth itself. Hayward derived his notion of reverence for things. Among the myriad creatures, there is none that does not bear Hanul. For Hayward, not only non-human being is to be treated as a non-person just because he or she happened to be born a peasant, a slave, or a woman, but also an animal, a bird, or even a single blade of grass is to be honored and respected as an embodiment of Hanul. At the time, late 19th century in Korea, there was slave system, aristocracy, and Haewol actually freed his slaves, and the slave girls that he adopted actually accepted them as family members and daughters, and he educated them. For Haewol, God is indwelling in a woman who was weaving the cloth. Hanul can be recognized not only in human subject, but also in birds and even in non-organic things, so-called materials or myriad things. Everything is embracing God, while God is indwelling in everything. The difference between these two sentences is the working subject. If you are working God, you are Hanul. When referring to the letter, God as the subject is working through the embodied. For Haewol, the working subject is Goding, leaving the divine as Hanul. Similarly, Robert Corrington uses Gerald Hopkins' term, selving, S-E-L-V-I-N-G, selving, to make this point. As the selving process is found through the orders of nature, it follows that this precarious gift must itself be nurtured from a source outside of itself. He writes, selving is a gift of that dimension of God that drives toward the future and the manifestation of greater actuality and consciousness. I understand Corrington's selving as Goding, so becoming somehow like beyond oneself as Goding by good acts, like sustainable acts. For it manifests the divine through a self as a bearer of Hanul. Corrington himself, in his book, Nature Sublime, states that perhaps the best term for the selving process is Goding, with a hyphen. This coming into the self from beyond is instinctively felt to be extra-human, indeed divine. For Corrington, the depth dimension of autonomy, selving, is theonomy, Goding, that is rooted in the divine. Likewise, everything in the world has the marvelous divine quality. It is not exceptional to a human being, to a bird, or even to a tiny dust particle. Haewol even called rice pap. Rice is Hanul, as well as human beings. Human, or food is God, right? Human beings eat foods which are Hanul. Therefore, life eats life. Hanul eats Hanul. There was an episode that Haewol, broken-hearted when he heard a harsh stepping sound on the ground, and worried and cried for the earth because in his view, the earth is Hanul's face. As he thought, do not spit on the ground, for that is Hanul's face. Haewol's care for the earth can be recognized as divine care. Similarly, McDaniel writes that we become participants in the divine life, experiencing love without jealousy, which characterize God's care for the world. In so doing, the image of God within us becomes a likeness of God, Imago Dei. Nonetheless, according to McDaniel's witness, today's humanity is indeed spitting on the ground, and with substances much more dangerous than saliva. People contaminate the earth by the irresponsible disposal of chemicals and trash. Both Hewell and McDaniel agree with the fact that the earth is God's body, which needs to be revered. For McDaniel, the earth as God's body includes our own bodies, as well as the rocks, wind, water, fire, and all things of nature. Then whatever humankind has done to the earth is something we do to God as well as to ourselves, because we, as human beings, are a part of this cosmic body, Hanul. This planet, as Hanul, is a shared community, like Shirley MacLaine's term, oikos, home, divine home. We live into one another's lives and die one another's death. Everyone's life depends on the lives of all others, like symbiotic relationship, living together and dying together, sharing together, eating together, contaminating together, and healing together, mending together. This symbiotic unity lives together and dies together as the divine conviviality, like conviviality. I show these diagrams, and I made this like Hanul as macrocosmic body, and there is an open end of this spiral, because life is not just like closed circle or hierarchical, like a square kind, or rectangular or linear, but it is more like a circular motion coming back to another people's lives and coming back to whatever we have done to the earth. So it's kind of karmic relational, non-linear kind of circular motion, but it is not closed circle, but it's open end. But Hanul as macrocosm, we can divide into Hanul as microcosm, like one individual entity, but symbolically I put like three, like reverence towards God, and or reverence toward like the whole cosmic unity, or like holistic entirety, and reverence toward the human, other humans, yourself, and reverence toward the myriad things. But you can draw endless spirals of the spirals again and again, like rhizomic, delusion, rhizomic, like roots of tree. And if we combine these two pictures together, and Hanul as the cosmic wholeness, in this process, Hanul cannot be described as by a definition. This aspect I would call convolution, like evolving together. But we need to think of involution as well, because Western kind of historical perspective is linear, like linearly evolving. Then there should be some kind of end, apocalyptic end of the world. But life is more like a returning, so evolution and involution. Evolution and involution. Without involution, there is no spiral. So coming to nature again, or nature's way again. So Robert Corrington calls the divine conviviality involution, the guarding energy in the individual self that opens into the larger adaptive prospect on the spiritual level that can accelerate spiritual evolution. Perhaps the process of hybridization can be well explained by Whiteheadian concrete togetherness. Everything connects to every other things. And my advisor and Dr. Mater, Catherine Keller, always say the thing. But I actually cannot really say that is really important, because the interconnectedness, everything connects to every other things. It's apparently true, so we don't have to prove that. But what we have to focus on is how to connect to others. How? There is ethical dimension. The process eco-theologian Catherine Keller calls togetherness a pluri-singularity. I am individual, but at the same time, the macrocosmic whole, so pluri-singularity. In terms of her definition of becoming as intercarnation, becoming together in this kind of holistic entanglement of the world. and translate Elohim as a different constancy of the singular God, the cosmic many that compose, that all fold into a coincidentia with the divine one. Our planetary life is the sacred body of which human beings are a part, but it's also a divine body. Not a part as an ontological fixity of a huge circle, but microcosmic becoming of endless hybridizing macrocosmic body. The planet is then understood as one vast organism, vast ecosystem, or biosystem, or biobody, body of God, according to Sally McFagg. Affiliated through this amazing divine connection, this natural world is basically life with a capital L. The full movement of becoming together, Deluge states that the plant sings of the glory of God, and while being filled all the more with itself, it contemplates and intensely contracts the element, hence it proceeds. It feels in this prehension the self-enjoyment of its own becoming. So I want to share with you kind of Harold's episode. One day, Harold actually stayed at his disciple's house, Sateksan, and he listened to kind of noise of cloth being woven. And he asked the son, "Who is weaving the cloth?" "My daughter-in-law is." "Is the person weaving cloth really your daughter-in-law?" Because of the repetitive question, so hesitated to answer, then Harold replied, "The one who is weaving the cloth now is Hanul, not your daughter-in-law." In that time, there was really provocative statement. There is not even one little thing which is not Hanul in the world. In recognizing the value of human labor as Goding, at a time when human labor was ignored as a work of the low classes, the narrative of this episode elevates human labor and the working human as that of a sacred work, and the divine by saying Hanul is working. Not only Goding, Hanul is working, but also Salim. It's like household task. The woman's job was disregarded at the time, and probably even nowadays too. In Korean, the narrow meaning of term Salim, enlivening, traditionally related to maybe Salim? Okay. Traditionally related to household tasks such as weaving clothes is mainly a task of women. In Korean society, at the time when women and the task related to female gender roles were disregarded for the most part, Harold recognized Salim, woman's household task, as God's creative action, and woman, the subject of Salim, as Hanul, divine, or that which is sacred. For Harold, God is labor, the subject of Salim, who keeps working for life. All forms of life, even non-organic matter, already have embodied Hanul, while they are involved in specific movement. When Harold called the weaving woman Hanul, the divine, he offered an extraordinary emancipatory praxis, a decolonizing message. His notion of reverence, kyung, is one in which there will be no discrimination of the poor under the rich, woman under man, and human under nature, or organic matter and non-organic matter, because we are evolving together and evolving together. The life practice of Soon was consistent with this vision. He freed his household servant and adopted them as his daughters. At the time, they are called like Minjung, like the subaltern, lower class people, especially women. As Minjung refers to the powerless people in society, politically, economically, and sexually, according to Gramsci, who focuses on the historicity of the subaltern as classy word. Spivak, actually, Gayatri Spivak, interpreted subaltern beyond a classy word, but woman as gendered subaltern. But I actually said that nature is ecological subaltern under human colonization. So I try to talk more or beyond human colonization, beyond another human group or another human country, but it's human colonization beyond other human being, especially poor human being, and also nature and human beings are a part. So it's almost like anthropocentric rather than against anthropocentrism, but beyond that. So from a post-colonial perspective, it is problematic to recognize the subaltern as well as the Minjung as classy term. I think I actually explained a lot here. So elaborating on Spivak's suggestion, I consider nature as a new subaltern in the anthropocentric world. Because in her essay, Can Subaltern Speak?, her answer was no. Then feminist theologians and feminist philosophers kind of complained to Spivak, why you said women cannot speak. But Spivak's answer was, now you can speak, that's good. But Spivak's answer was the language, the written language, were historically men. That means women have spoken, but their voice was not heard. That means they were mute. So I say that nature is mute by human colonization, including human nature. Both colonialism and neocolonialism are about human colonization over other humans. Neocolonialism is often recognized as economic imperialism that practices capitalistic power, military control, and political control by a nation to other nations in the age of a global economy. The same colonial mindset have created a similar damaging illusion about human mastery of nature. I think that is human audacity, because we are just a part of that nature or cosmic whole. Now is the time to think about human colonization over nature. Since post-colonial theory helps to find the otherness of nature as a new subaltern, one can say that nature is not simply a projection of the human mind that can be exploited by human needs, but something that suffers as well as becomes abundant, in which human beings are a part as living organisms. We should rethink subalternization of nature as similar to the subaltern woman as the othered subject. Nature, non-human, more than human, is the othered subject in the subalternization of nature as object of discursive management and control. Non-human nature has been manipulated and recognized only in terms of its instrumental value, not in terms of its intrinsic value. Elaborating on the Spivakian notion of the silencing the subaltern, I can say that nature is mute. In this regard, Shelley McFadden also suggests in The Body of God that we have to recognize nature as a new poor, which means bodily poverty in the dualistic hierarchy of humanity over nature. I would use McFadden's metaphor to describe the mutation of nature as the new subaltern. This is the body of God that cannot speak. Non-human nature is not only bodily poverty as the new poor, but also sacred body of divine immanence. Keller, in her book, Cloud of the Impossible, talks about our planetary living. This is theology, not physics. The God who may be, God perhaps, the perspective of the unfolding infinite will no more do our physics for us than fix climate change, unquote. We have to confess that the climate crisis is a human-made problem. Now is the time for metanoia, repentance, and healing, and change. Then it's our responsibility to constrain on ethical action. Indeed, climate change is an irresponsible, not irresponsible, humans are irresponsible, an irresistible moral storm. Thus, it is a theological project, and socially speaking, ethical project. It is an intergenerational crisis. It's our past, present, and future. Nevertheless, what humans have been doing toward our planet is suicidal. Land, air, water, trees, birds, fishes, rabbits, and humans, we all are vulnerable to climate change. Those that we deem to be subaltern, the bottom of anthropocentric hierarchy, the marginalized, the less powerful humans, and more than humans, soil, air, water, etc., have suffered the most from climate change. Humans have colonized other planetary beings and the planet herself, the body of God. Once again, I announce that nature has been subalternized. It is at this juncture that we must re-evaluate our ethical consciousness, as Willis Jenkins writes, quote, a major reason that economic activists impoverish Earth is because none of those actions pays the true cost of the ecological resources and services it uses. Social behavior does not adequately respond to biological impoverishment because the human economy fails to value the biodiversity it uses. The inevitable consequence is overuse and encroachment to the point of collapse, unquote. By the same token, Larry Rasmussen calls for our ethical framework to evolve not by leaving the cultures we know, but by expanding our capacity to be inclusive and creative, shifting our economic activity toward growth that is both ecologically sustainable and regenerative, probably Salim consciousness, like enlivening and sustainable consciousness. The difficult task of maintaining a utilitarian sense of benefit that is as broad as it is deep actually becomes reality. Yeah, we as anthropocentric collectives, anthropocentrism has been criticized by many ecological theologians, but Mary Evelyn Tucker said, we are anthro-cosmocentric. That means we need to take care of humans as well. I like that term because post-colonial eco-theology doesn't reject human. Yeah, eco-theologians care about human first too. Needs to cast out demonic delusion of greedy ownership and put on planetary consciousness, which I call Salim consciousness, as a new paradigm for the future of our planet. Theology is for the planetary and cosmic complementarity of all living and even in inorganic things. I love inorganic things. It doesn't mean consumeristically love inorganic things, but we have to keep recycling and put the value on it. We do not need a standard form of comparative theological dialogue for Goding. Goding is all of collective activities of enlivening. Salim. Salim is a Korean term, and 죽임 refers to all destructive activities such as killing, marginalization, oppression, exploitation, coercion, colonization, contamination of the environment, destruction of the ecosystem, etc. 죽임 is not natural, but exists contrary to nature and the unnatural activities of life, which engage in violence. Any religion that practices 죽임 against life becomes an empire. When theology points us toward respect for life and planetary living, it becomes post-colonial. Life is more fundamental than any isms. Scientism, religionism, Americanism, Orientalism, nationalism, authoritarianism, imperialism, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. As long as there is a destructive force of 죽임 against life, we can't stop continuing Salim dialogues. The meaning of Salim is not just life, but it suggests a quality of living, the enhanced life. In a Whiteheadian sense, life is to live well, and to live better. The meaning of Salim is becoming better, restoring, healing, and mending, decolonizing, and bringing about reconciliation, sanctification, and therefore guarding, a continuing genesis, creatio continua. The earth, our home, including us, is a sacred body, which is Hanul, the sacred, divinely hopes to maintain life, and furthermore pursues a better living by renewing and regenerating together in the decolonizing process of life. And at the end, I want to share with 10 negatives for Hanul as the sacred, 신무천 by Haewol, the follower of Suun. Do not deceive Hanul, do not ignore Hanul, do not hurt Hanul, do not disturb Hanul, do not kill Hanul, do not contaminate Hanul, do not starve Hanul, do not destroy Hanul, do not hate Hanul, do not defeat Hanul. Thank you so much. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Dr. O. Our first respondent for the evening is Dr. David Haberman. He is professor of religious studies at Indiana University, where he teaches courses on Hinduism and religion and ecology. A former Guggenheim and Fulbright Fellow, Dr. Haberman's recent books include River of Love in the Age of Pollution, the Yamuna River in Northern India, and People Trees, Worship of Trees in Northern India. He is also the editor of a forthcoming volume on cross-cultural perspectives on religion and climate change. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Haberman.
Okay, good evening. It's hard to see through these lights, but it looks like a warm group out there on a chilly night. I have been given the task of responding in about 10 minutes to Professor O's talk and to say something about Hinduism and ecology. So we've just heard about the Donghak Korean system and a deep ecology of reverence. So I thought I would maybe echo that or give a parallel notes on that by way of saying something about these two subjects from the perspective of Vedantic Hinduism. And let's see if I can work all this technology. I was assuming that there would be a monitor here that I could see see what you're seeing, but that turns out not to be the case. So I'll see if I can use my computer and somehow keep us both on the same page. Because I want to read some quotes. So what is Vedant? Vedant means the culmination of the Vedas. It's considered to be one of the most important, and I would say popular, of the religious philosophical systems in India, based on texts like the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And I'm going to just select a few quotes that would give a sense of the Vedantic conception of reality. So might begin with the second. The self within all is a self of yours, because I want to emphasize the conception of self that comes out of the Vedantic traditions. And we see here a notion of a radically interconnected self. The self, the Atma, is Brahman. Brahman is the term that is used in the Upanishadic text to refer to the to ultimate reality itself, to that radically interconnected sense of reality. And here we're told that our self is that somehow our self is non-different from the totality of reality called Brahman. It is the whole. As all the spokes are fastened to the hub and rim of a wheel, so to oneself are fastened all beings, all gods, all worlds, all the breaths, and all other selves. Here's that interconnected notion of self that I am highlighting here. And sarvam kalvidam brahma. That is that everything truly, that is everything we experience with our senses, truly is Brahman. So that it says in the Bhagavad Gita that the yogi, or the enlightened being, we might say, sees all beings with an equal eye, sees the self in all beings and all beings in the self. There's that interconnected notion that somehow everything, all selves, participate in the same source reality. And part of what comes out of this is a very complex notion of a radical interconnected reality. So it's not simply a perspective that is promoting a sense of unity. It certainly is doing that, but simultaneously is promoting a sense of diversity. Again, not a system that is obliterating the value of each precious, unique part for the whole, but rather both of those are kept alive. A radical sense of equality that I think is expressing something like difference without hierarchy. We certainly in the world today know difference with great hierarchy, where the high are pressing down the low, etc. But difference without hierarchy. Well, the Upanishadic texts themselves promote or aim for a transformation of an identity with a self that is somehow autonomous, separate, that egotistical limited self, to somehow move beyond that to an identification with the self that is radically interconnected with everything. That is really one of the major projects of the Upanishadic or Vedantic texts, and that process of shifting the identity from the limited self to the radically interconnected self is known as self-realization. Well, these are ideas that have come to one of the most important figures in the Hindu Indian environmental movement, and that is Mahatma Gandhi. He, as I say, is one who grew up in the context of Vedantic notions. And selected two texts here to get at that. The ocean is composed of drops of water. Each drop is an entity, and yet it is part of a whole. There's that sense of the simultaneity of the part and the whole I'm talking about, the one and the many. In this ocean of life, we are little drops. My doctrine means that I must identify, there's that technical term, to identify myself with all life, with everything that lives, that I must share the majesty of life in the presence of God. The sum total of this life is God. It's that holistic perspective. I believe in the absolute oneness of God and therefore of humanity. Mahatma Gandhi was particularly interested in issues of social justice. And the two issues of his day he was tackling were colonialism and the caste system, two hierarchical systems that did not promote equality in any way. One of the people who was greatly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi was Martin Luther King. And just 1 week ago today, we celebrated Martin Luther King Day. So I thought I would show how these ideas were worked into Martin Luther King's own conceptions. This is part of his statement that he made in the form of his letter from Birmingham jail. And Dr. King went to Birmingham to support those who were fighting social injustice and racism there, and was jailed as part of his protests. And he was criticized by the local clergy for being an outsider, coming in and stirring up trouble in their community. And this is part of his response. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So his argument in some sense is that everyone matters. We're all in this together. And that my presence here is very appropriate. Well, to return to Mahatma Gandhi, a couple other quotes. I believe in Advaita, the Upanishadic term for non-duality, the kind of monism that is promoted in that text. I believe in the essential unity of man and, for that matter, of all that lives. The rock-bottom foundation of the technique for achieving the power of nonviolence is a belief in the essential oneness of all life. With this statement, Gandhi goes beyond the boundary of the human. You know what? I'm not keeping up with this. Here is Martin Luther King. Sorry, I've got two things going on here. This was his Birmingham jail statement. And here is the text that I want to work with now. In the first one, Gandhi is going beyond the human. He was very well known for allowing no trees to be cut or snakes to be harmed in his ashram in Ahmedabad, India. That is, that everything matters. Everything is included in this. My religion embraces all life. I want to realize brotherhood or identity. There's that technical term here once again. For self-realization is that expansion of a compassionate care for all beings, all entities. I want to realize brotherhood or identity not merely with beings called human, but I want to realize identity with all life, even with such things as crawl upon the earth. I want to, if I don't give you a shock, to realize identity with even the crawling things upon the earth, because we claim descent from the same God, and that being so, all life, in whatever form it appears, must be essentially one. He goes to the lowest level of life, those things that crawl on the earth, because again, just to include the upper realms would be asserting a hierarchical system of judgment again. This is all-inclusive, and therefore he goes for the lowest. So here Gandhi is expressing a position that is highly critical of what is called in environmental philosophy anthropocentrism. The idea that we human beings are superior to and somehow separate from all beings on earth. And Gandhi cuts through that with an all-encompassing, all-embracing compassion of care and involvement with all. A particular student of Gandhi's became very interested in his conception of self and that all encompassing compassion. And that is the Norwegian philosopher Arne Naess. Here we don't see him in such a young picture, but when he first came under the influence of Gandhi, he was a professor of the age 25 at the University of Oslo. And here he says in one of his most important articles called Self-Realization, there's that term again that is used by Gandhi that comes out conceptually from Vedantic literature. We underestimate ourselves. I emphasize self. We tend to confuse it with the narrow ego. Human nature is such that with sufficient all-sighted maturity, we cannot avoid identifying, technical term again, ourselves with all beings. There's that expression of self-realization, the title of Naess's article. And he subtitles it, An Ecological Approach to Being in the World, with a double meaning. That is, that this is an approach to thinking about the nature of being, of existence in the world, as it's a verb, a way of being in the world. And he means both of those. The requisite care flows naturally if the self is widened and deepened so the protection of nature is felt and conceived as protection of ourselves. What Arne Naess is saying is that it's not that when we identify with another being, and this comes out of Gandhi and picked up by Martin Luther King, and that is that we do violence to the other to the degree that we see the other as radically other. We don't go around sticking knives in our own body unless we're somehow deeply disturbed psychologically. But people do stick knives in others because they're not identifying with them. And that with that identification, one participates in the joy of another. As a parent might feel that participation when his or her child is dancing on the stage successfully. You feel that joy. That same joy could be experienced as a butterfly dances across a spring meadow. The same joy can be experienced when porpoise do those acrobatic dives that they do. Participation in that joy. But the joy and wonder of the world also involves a kind of responsibility and care. The act of love is a participation in the other. But it also then means that one has to extend that concern to that other. And that's what Arne Naess is saying here, that the defense of nature is really tantamount to one's defense of oneself. If a man is attacking a mother's child with a knife, and that mother can get the knife away from a child, then away from the man and somehow destroy it, she would be celebrated in the press the next day as a great hero. If someone goes in and destroys a bulldozer that is poised to take out an old-growth forest, that act will be represented as an act of eco-terrorism. What's the difference between the two acts? And from a deep ecological perspective, the philosophical perspective that was articulated by Arne Naess becomes the foundation of a lot of the so-called radical environmental groups. The difference is a different notion of self. One stops at an identification with a close human relative, where the other one expands outward to extend that loving circle of compassion to include much, much more. So here is the direction of self-realization, from an identification first with close humans, and then outward, expanding to include all of nature. Well, quickly, what I would like to do is now shift from a philosophical perspective to an ethnographic perspective, from black and white to color. Because what I would like to do is move out of the realm of deep ecology, which is an articulation of Hindu Vedantic thought, to more of a universal application of the environmental situation. I want to turn to close with a look at something much more particularly Hindu, Indian in all that. And that is a look at, as the circle of self-realization expands out, there's a realization that everything is sacred. Perhaps the most radical thought that we can think in and hold and act on is that notion of that everything is sacred. And that is the outer limit of self-realization. Well, there's a devotional attitude. There is a reverence toward the world. There's a reverence toward all entities that comes out of such realization. So I thought I would end with a few slides that get at the way that reverence gets articulated and expressed in terms of worshipful interaction with or devotional interaction with natural entities such as trees, rivers, and mountains. So here's an example of a tree shrine. Trees are considered to be either the abode or the body of a god or goddess and worshipped accordingly. Whenever the new moon falls on a Monday, women in northern India will circle a sacred tree such as this one 108 times, in this case worshiping it as a form of Vishnu. Want to look at the intimate interaction with a tree that is considered to be the embodied form of a goddess, where the intimacy is drawn out by putting a face on the tree itself. So I want to mark this different from anthropocentrism and call this more anthropomorphism, where I'm going to have to wrap up here quickly. The slides. How could I, see, I'm used to doing these where, I'm going to go back. There's the expansion of self, and here's what I wanted to begin with. Let me hold this and just talk off these if I can. So these are the tree shrines that I'm referring to. Here is the worship of the tree shrines. A particular tree, the people tree, one of the most sacred trees in India, on the occasion of the Somvati Amavasya, where women interact in a reverent way with the tree as an embodied form of the Hindu god Vishnu. This particular tree is a tree, the neem tree, shows up in a lot of health products these days, but it is understood to be an embodied form of the goddess Nimamai in northern India. So I like this slide because it shows that intimacy. Faces are added to the trees. I think this is where I catch up with where I was. And I want to mark a difference between anthropocentrism and anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism, there's a consensus in the fields of cognitive, evolutionary, and developmental psychology, as well as cognitive neuroscience, that human beings are born hardwired with to interact with, to connect with the human face. And this is true of all social mammalian species, such as sheep, dogs, and monkeys. But for the human, so it's as though the divine is a multifaceted jewel, where only one of the facets is the human face. But for humans, that's the face we connect with. So faces are added to the tree as a way of both honoring the tree. This is a way of dressing her up to honor her, but also to connect with her. And that's what people say. They do this to better connect with some form. And it does lead to protection. Here's a man who worships a tree in such a fashion in his sweet shop in the city of Benares in northern India. And just to jag him a bit, I said, well, why don't you just cut that tree down? You'd have more room in your shop. And he, as I knew he would be, was horrified by the question. And his point was, he said that if I were to do that, this tree is providing blessings to my business, to my family, and my business would be ruined and my family destroyed if I were to do that to this tree. So again, a face is placed. The presence is there in the tree, the divine presence. But to draw it out, to bring it out, a face is placed on that, so that that intimate devotional relationship can be nurtured. I don't have slides really of the work I did on the river, but this river, the Yamuna, that runs through northern India, is also considered to be the embodied form of a goddess. and to bring her personality out, to enhance our sense of that divine presence. There are ritual forms of interaction. Here on her birthday, she is dressed up with a sari made of 108 saris that are stretched from shore to shore. I want to end with an example of a sacred mountain that I've spent the last few years studying. I grew up in Colorado climbing mountains, and from a Colorado mountain boy's standards, this is a rather small mountain. It's a rocky ridge of about 7 miles long, but still, how does one relate to in an intimate fashion? Because it's in an intimate connection with a particular that we really connect with something much, much larger. So how does one do that? It's in an interaction with an individual stone. Our most intimate relationships are with individuals. Something like universal human love is a very noble idea. We need much more of it in the world today. But we know that our most intimate connections are with individuals. So here's a man singing devotional songs to an individual stone. And this is Shringar, a way of honoring some entity within Hinduism, is to address it elaborately, such as this. When eyes are added, though, things really change. The anthropologist Alfred Gell said that when eyes are added to some object, it opens up and gives access to interiority. Lovers connect by staring each other's eyes. Right? We could go on. It's that connection with eyes. And the full Shringar, the dressing up a stone. So here's an example of a stone on the edge of the sacred mountain that is, the reverence is being expressed through these particular cultural modes of Hindu worship. So I guess I want to bring this back home, that this is more of a particular cultural expression of that reverence of the sacrality of the whole world, by developing that relationship with the whole through a particular stone, in this case, of the larger mountain that one has that intimate relationship with in a very loving fashion. For these are acts of loving the world, again in an intimate form, in an individual form. And maybe I'll just end on this one note, and that is, if someone comes to you in some harsh fashion, screaming in your face, what do you want to do? You pull back, you hide yourself. On the other hand, when someone comes to you in a very loving fashion, we tend to come out and reveal ourselves. And this is what we're talking about. How does one come to some sense of, experience of, awareness of the deep sacrality of all life in its many, many different forms? And the answer is, again, through a loving approach. So I tried to end with some specific examples of a loving approach in addition to looking at a more universal form that we call deep ecology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Haberman. Our second respondent is Dr. Adrienne Krohn, who is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies and Director of Jewish Life at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania, outside of Erie, where she teaches courses on Judaism, American religious history, religion and ecology, religion and food, and religion and animals. Her current research focuses on religious responses to industrial food and the Jewish communal farms movements. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adrienne Krohn.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. O and Dr. Haberman. I'll be offering a Jewish version of some of these kind of thinking through our place in the world in a different way. So Jewish tradition similarly offers one of these kind of decentering versions of where humanity fits in creation. I'll talk about one of the ways that it does that, and then I'll offer a brief glimpse into some of the ways that Jewish people are enacting these Jewish environmental ethics as they reckon with the climate crisis. So the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible actually assume an agricultural society. And the assumption is that in that society, humans are both shaping and then are shaped by their local ecology. So for this reason, there are laws about how to grow food, when to harvest it. The Jewish calendar itself is shaped by seasons and by harvests. And there are passages throughout the Hebrew Bible that offer troubleshooting for times when animals had disease or when the rains weren't coming. So the question the Hebrew Bible is really answering isn't whether humans should engage in agriculture, but rather how humans, and Jews in particular, should be engaging in agricultural activities. So these agricultural laws are laid out early in the Hebrew Bible, and then they're expanded upon through rabbinic texts, as is the case with most of Jewish tradition. And I think that the laws of Shemitah offer a particularly good example of how Jews were meant to engage the land. So Shemitah means release, and it's a set of practices that set up a cyclical agricultural cycle that includes regular sabbatical years for the land. So the same way that humans are commanded to rest after 6 days of work, they're also commanded to let the land rest after it has been worked for 6 years. And practicing Shemitah then requires communal collaboration and planning, because during that 7th year, when the land is resting, only perennial crops that come up every year that you don't have to plant or seed, only those crops can be consumed in those years. So you have to think about planting trees and planting some of these things that will be there for you in that year, and feeding people who don't have access to their own land, people and animals. So the laws of Shemitah have been interpreted through rabbinic tradition as a reminder to humans that the land does not belong to them. They can and should steward it in order to grow food, but the land has its own needs, and those needs sometimes supersede those of humans. This kind of echoes the concept of Hanul that Dr. O was describing, where all creatures and all organic beings and inorganic beings should be approached with reverence because they're inherently worthy of that reverence. I should mention a couple issues with Shemitah. So first, there's actually no historical evidence that Shemitah was ever fully enacted. So it seems really a good idea and also really difficult. Second, the rabbis understood the laws of Shemitah to be only applicable within the boundaries of the land of Israel, where most Jews even still currently don't live. And third, Jews have been disconnected from land in general, both by choice and by force over the centuries. So we don't have a fully developed sense of how Shemitah would work in practice. For these and other reasons, we don't know what the world could have been like had it been governed by these principles. Instead, we find ourselves facing the consequences of a very different approach to engaging the environment. So what does Jewish tradition offer for our current predicament? There's a story in the Talmud, the 6th century rabbinic compendium of Jewish law, about the famous 1st century sages, Rabbis Hillel and Shammai. Shammai said that it would have been better if humans had never been created than if they had been created. Hillel said it would have been better had humans been created than if they had not been created. A vote was held, and it was concluded that it would have been better had humans not been created, but since they were, they should search their deeds. In other words, though humanity has been damaging to the world around them, and this is an early 500-600 conversation, so there's already a recognition then that humans are a problem. So even though humans have been damaging, humans were created, so they have to start living their best moral lives to rectify the damage that they're doing. The story offers a way to think about our relationship to the climate crisis. It would have been better had we not done this damage to our planet. But now that we are faced with the climate crisis, what is the most moral way to move forward? How can we use these ancient Jewish models to search our deeds and live in a way that can minimize the harm that we inflict upon the earth and perhaps even begin to repair some of that past damage? I study the Jewish community farming movement, which is a movement of around 20 organizations that are bound together by a dual focus on environmental and food justice, though they have developed methods, models, and goals independently and in line with the communities that they serve. So I'll offer one example of how one of these organizations has been inspired by these agricultural and environmental ethics that they found within Jewish tradition to address environmental issues in their area. At Shoresh Jewish Environmental Programs in Toronto, Ontario, Executive Director Risa Allison Cooper and Director of Engagement Sabrina Malik are dedicated to what they call sustainable land-based Judaism. They have gardens throughout Toronto that they work in collaboration with other nonprofit organizations. And they also have a 120-acre stretch of land in Erin, Ontario, which is about 40 minutes outside of Toronto, that they steward, again, in partnership with other organizations. And that farm is called Bela Farm. This farm was previously a commercial farm, and a significant portion of their work there is dedicated to repairing the soil and rebuilding local ecologies. This summer, they planted thousands of trees along the edges of the land and on the hilltops in partnership with the local government program. In the coming years, the trees will provide a barrier against wind erosion, which has been detrimental to the soil on these hills. As the trees begin to grow and the soil rests, Risa and Sabrina have turned their attention to protecting and growing the local pollinator population, which has been in decline due to commercial pesticide use, a nearby water bottling operation, and the changing climate, which has brought erratic weather patterns to their area. Sabrina picked up an interest in beekeeping while working on a different Jewish farm, and then she returned to Toronto and focused on pollinator protection in urban centers in her graduate work in environmental studies. She now combines her knowledge and passion in her work at Shoresh. The bees at Shoresh are Apis mellifera, which are also known as European honeybees. This species of bees pollinates more than 1/3 of global produce. And since 2006, beekeepers in the US, Canada, and Europe have dealt with colony collapse disorder, otherwise known as CCD. Just to give you a sense, in the US, beekeepers face an annual honeybee mortality rate averaging about 30% due to CCD. And so restoring some of the honeybee population, but also some of the native pollinator populations became a priority for Shoresh. And they're using their land at Bela Farm especially to do that. They refer to their work as community-supported beekeeping, and they ensure that the Jewish community in Toronto has plenty of opportunities to learn about bees, about colony collapse disorder, and other local pollinators. They've dedicated about 20 acres of their land in what they call a bee sanctuary. They've planted out about 4 acres of that land so far, and they call that the bee buffet. And there's 720 seedlings that were planted there, and then 2 million seeds. And so they call that the bee buffet. They currently have 9 beehives and hope to grow up to 30. The Shoresh staff recognize the damage that was done to their land in previous generations, and although they cannot undo that damage, they're committed to repairing and rebuilding this land now that they're the stewards of it. They take their inspiration from Jewish tradition, where they were grateful to find a wealth of environmental resources. Risa called it a radical aha moment when she made the connection between her Judaism and her environmentalism, and this is her quote. Not only do these two things go together, but to bridge these two worlds of Jewish tradition and environmental sustainability, they just strengthen one another in such deep and profound ways. The Jewish community farming organizations like Shoresh make living out some of these ancient Jewish ecological principles that were meant for Jewish communities living in very different times and places, both practical and possible. These organizations are addressing the climate crisis head on in their work with the land and in their educational programs. A quote from the previously mentioned Rabbi Hillel is a frequent piece of these educational programs. Quoted in the rabbinic text Pirkei Avot, Hillel said, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, who am I? If not now, when?" The Jewish community farming movement has answered this question, posed about 2,000 years ago, in relation to the climate crisis. They are drawing on their tradition, they're searching their deeds, and acting now, because they recognize that if they don't, the next generation may not have the chance. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Crone. So we have time for some questions. There's a fun new microphone that will be making its way around. It's sort of a foam cube. And the best part is it can be thrown. Takes some time away from passing the microphone around through the aisles, so there it is. Riley has it, it's magical. So seriously, don't be afraid of it, just throw it to the next person. So please do wait until I call on you to get the microphone, both so our speakers can hear your question, but also so our video recording can pick it up for YouTube later. So do I see any questions for either directed to a particular panelist or to the whole group? I'm trying to see too. All right, great. Right here in the blue. Just talk into it.
So, I don't remember the name of the term, but there's a Jewish term for repairing the world, the notion that humans invariably break the world.
Move it down a little more.
Hold it down.
No, your head down a little bit.
How about that? Do you hear me now?
It's not on.
I don't see a switch on it.
It's a placebo money. Big stakeout.
There it is.
So, I can't remember the name of the. Okay. So, can you say something about that? So, this notion that seems inevitable, right, that human beings progressively destroy the world. But this notion that our role ought to be in repairing the world seems an important idea.
Yeah, so that's another common piece of the educational programs at the Jewish community farms. It actually comes out of Jewish mysticism, and it's an idea that humans are meant to be a partner with God in repairing creation. There's some sense, again, that something's gone wrong, and humans, especially Jews, in the case of Judaism, it's mostly a particularistic tradition, and so there's some sense that Jews have a particular responsibility then to work alongside God and towards the repair of the world. And that's usually understood more closely aligned with doing the mitzvot, the commandments. And so if you're doing mitzvot, you're adding to the repairing of the world. But contemporary Jews interpret that as much broader, much more broadly applicable, and it's the reason that you see Jews involved in social justice movements pretty broadly across the spectrum in high numbers.
It's right behind you. Oh, you already have it. Great.
This one's for the panel, I suppose, but so humans are kind of, at least compared to other species, oddly not well suited for nature. And so that obviously contributes to the exploitive behaviors that have been demonstrated in history. And so if a god or an ultimate being created us, would this be in that ultimate being's design for kind of nature to be corrupted?
Well,
That's the Odyssey problem, that if God is good, then why evil exists in the world? Sounds like that. But in that sense, we should should presuppose God as the omnipotent God. But Charles Harson's book, I'm a Process Thinker, Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes, already talked about that kind of theodicy problem somehow doesn't resolve this kind of all mess, which doesn't look like it's God's fault, but it's like Anthropocene's fault, which means we are all responsible. And probably my theology of Goding, like living God rather than blaming God, it can be an answer.
I've got the microphone. How does Anul compare to Tao?
Could you repeat your question?
How does Hanul compare
to Tao?
To Tao?
Yeah, that's really important question, and Taoistic kind of understanding and aspect in Tonghak, Eastern learning. Kind of Tao, probably you are from some kind of your knowledge about Tao Te Ching, but the Tao in Tao Te Ching chapter 1 that can be called is not the constant Tao. The name that can be called is not the constant name. Some people actually interpreted the sang, the constancy, consistency, as eternal, but that is not really appropriate interpretation of Shang, the consistency, because Tao is ever becoming and ever path making. So according to Roger Ames, Tao is interpreted as path making, the way making. I probably can say that Tao, in that sense, is guarding, like living, salim, enlivening, sustainable living. But then Tao is not actually like ontological, transcendental God. In that sense, Hanul is also process-related whole entirety of becoming together. Then, does that make sense?
Yes.
Thank you.
Down here in front. Good catch.
Okay, am I doing this right? Yeah. Well, I wonder if you've thought, each of you in your own ways, about economics and how it relates to our ecology problems, and what you think might be a solution to the conflict between making money and protecting the environment.
I think that's works well. Yeah, I think that's an important question. And we're often told that one has a choice between economic benefits or environmental benefits, as though the two are somehow completely separate. I think there's a whole field of environmental economics today that is questioning that dichotomy and really wondering whether there's any truth to that. That it turns out from many studies that in taking care of the environment, we're really benefiting the economy. And what is it really a matter of choices in ways? So if I want to put it back into the conceptual world of self, what is true self-interest? And economics has to do with caring for ourselves in a particular way. But if somehow the way we are taking care of ourselves is destroying the very life support systems that our lives depend upon, then is that really prudent activities that involve self-interest in any deep sense of the term? So it's clear that if any viable economic future is going to depend upon a healthy environment. And I think that finally these two ways of looking at any particular issue do have a much closer relationship than we're often led to believe.
And in addition to the wise explanation, the etymological origin of economy and ecology is the same with Greek words oikos. Oikos means household. So economy is oikonomos, that means managing household. And ecology is talking about household. So they are inseparable, actually. So, but seems like this neoliberal capitalistic kind of ideology value more on economy than ecology, but that is nonsense, actually.
Is it?
Yep.
Yeah, it's good to re-examine and re-identify what we mean by economy sometimes. Like, what is it, right? Okay, so I'm curious. I'm kind of a fan of Judaism, and when we're talking about or learning about the cyclical or spiral or expansionist, but still sort of process-oriented views of reality in some of the Eastern religions, Eastern philosophies. I'm curious about the mystical strain that I think believes in Judaism that is not a common sort of Western way of thinking about time and about how things evolve and how things are linear. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah,
as pertains to Judaism.
So the Shemitah cycle. So mysticism has very different conceptions of time, and how the world was created and how kind of creation itself is cyclical. But even within traditional rabbinic Judaism, you see things like Shemitah, where so every 7 years the land is supposed to rest. Every 7 cycles then of 7 years, this is actually something I took out, so I'm glad I got to sneak it in. Every 7 cycles of 7 years, in the 50th year, that's the Jubilee year, or in Hebrew, the Yuval year. And the idea that year, you kind of reset the whole system. So that year, all the land goes back to kind of the central governing body and gets redistributed. So that nobody, thinking about economy too, so that nobody can acquire too much over time. And so the whole thing is meant to be understood as this kind of cyclical, and there's economic pieces of Shemitah and the Jubilee year as well. So every 7 years, as you're releasing the land, you're also supposed to release your debts. And because the Hebrew Bible comes from another time, you're also supposed to release your slaves. So it's about releasing many different things. And then in the 50th year, you release everything. And Judaism contains within it this kind of idea of distributive justice, that nothing is meant to be kind of hoarded for one person. It's always communal, and it's always going to be reset at some point. Unfortunately, we've lost track of that. So we know when the Shemitah years are. There was one in 2014-15 on the Hebrew calendar, and there'll be one in 21-22, but we don't know when the Jubilee year is.
Maybe Orthodox.
I told you it was fun, right?
That is kind of fun. Okay, hello. My name is Jake. I have a question for Dr. Haberman. This is coming from someone who read an English translation of the Gita once a long time ago. How do you reconcile the whole idea you talked about with expanding the circle and the deep ecology of love and compassion to all things with a text, namely the Gita, which has been used, or at least seen in some ways as a justification of holy violence or some kind of, I know that Gandhi didn't use it like that, but the Gita certainly is about war, and it's about violence, and it's about how it can be okay sometimes. And I'm thinking about that towards the environment.
Right. Well, again, an important question that comes up when I often read Bhagavad Gita with students. And I don't want to get too far into Bhagavad Gita, but to answer that very specifically, it all hinges on the concept of swadharma. And the Gita is basically saying that everyone has a very particular role to play. And the Gita then articulates the most effective way of doing that to stay in touch with the higher reality. And the question is whether, so that the figure that is featured in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, is the general of the army. And the duty of a general of the army is to win wars. And he's in a particular bind because if he were to leave the battlefield, then obviously his side will get slaughtered if he goes. So the Gita has created a double bind situation. But the question is it really promoting war, or even the concept of just war, or is it working with something much more profound, looking at the particular example of Arjuna, who again happens to be the general of the army? So my dharma is not to fight wars. I'm a college professor, so it's to teach students. That's my own particular dharma. So I guess that the one way out of that is to radicalize swadharma. Gandhi did say that the Gita was perhaps one of the most important texts to him, if not the most important. And he saw it differently, and that is that the battle, and there's justification for this in the text, that the battle is with one's own ego, with the egoistic desire that leads to the greed and problems of the world. So that's Gandhi's own particular way out of it, which for him then supports the loving stance that one takes within Gandhi's sense of the world, because it's in that the move of love really is dependent upon the defeat of one's deep investment in the egoistic self.
Thank you.
Can you wait for the microphone, please, so we can get it on video?
Thank you. This might be one for Professor Haberman. Bringing it back a little closer territorially, in Indiana, we've had a lot of controversy in the last number of years about the management and treatment of our state forests, the aggressive logging practices that the state of Indiana Department of Natural Resources has installed. And so I just wondered, have you been following that? And do you have comments in terms of the, basically the lack of treatment of our forests as sacred places?
Yeah, I think an important question for those of us who live in the state of Indiana. How do we look at the non-human world? And I think that there are many things driving that question for us today, and probably topmost amongst them is the environmental crises. So Professor O has spoken of post-colonialism, which I think is another way to look at that, and that is that post-colonial studies opens up the doorway for respecting other cultures in a way that was not in place during the colonial period. So I think that's part of it. But again, I think really driving that question is the environmental crisis itself, because I think it's taught us that if we understand anything, we're beginning to understand that the human relationship with the more than human world, we've got that wrong, and it's coming back to bite us now in very, very negative ways. So the question is, how do we look at the forests? And how do we look at forests generally, but those of us who are residents of the state of, or citizens of the state of Indiana, I think are really faced with a situation, how do we regard the forests that are in our care, that are in our hold for future generations? And I think, again, it comes back to that sense of self, The anthropocentric notion of self that is still so deeply embedded in our institutions and our ways of thinking lead us to look at the rest of the world as basically a stage for the human drama, and everything is here for utilitarian purpose to serve human beings. I think that's precisely the worldview that has gotten us into the trouble we're in today. So the alternative is to begin to look at those as other kinds of beings, and that we develop then a relationship. And I guess what I tried in my very rapid way here is to present, certainly in another culture, that our relationship with trees, our relationship with forests and other natural entities is not some given in human existence, but rather it's culturally constructed in a great variety of ways. And I think once we understand that, then the question is, which way do we want to embrace? One of the managers of one of the state forests, the Yellowwood State Forest, said to me one day that he looks at the forest like a bean field, and they're just to be harvested like bean fields. That's that utilitarian way. Is that all a forest is? A forest is as a source of so much of the life support systems of our ecosystems in southern Indiana. And there are places, there are other uses for them even, and maybe even higher uses. There are places for reverence and of reverence. There are sanctuaries that renew our spirits in many ways. So the question is the only value in a tree simply timber to be sold on the open market, or is there other value there? And is there intrinsic value in other life forms in and of itself? I think these are important questions that ultimately should govern our policy. And I would invite bigger thinking, really, in the context of setting policies for what we want to do with the magnificent forests that still exist in southern Indiana.
I believe we have time for one more. Okay, seeing none, I will ask us to thank our speakers one more time and turn it over to Daniel Myers.
Before we close this evening, I just want to thank once again our various speakers, and a big thank you to the Global and Historical Studies program, Grace Unlimited, and the Philosophy, Religion, and Classics department here at Butler. If you're like me, you might be feeling some kind of mixture of extremely being troubled while also slightly hopeful. I find that to be consistent with other conversations around this topic. But I want to thank all three of you for bringing your wisdom and your thoughts to our campus today. And thank you to Dr. Heggie for your work on this seminar series, and thank you to Marguerite Stanchu, the Assistant Director of the CFB, for all your many details and big picture as you bring all of this together. If we could give them a round of applause, please. To learn more about the Center for Faith and Vocation and get us on a sign-up to learn about events like this one, please note we have a sign-up sheet in the lobby, and you can come check us out. Before you go, I also want to mention our next and final seminar in this series will be Monday, March 4th at 7 p.m. The second to last question, or I guess it was the last question, wondering about issues related to Indiana is a great segue. Our topic on Monday, March 4th is Greening Indiana, Theologies and Ethics of Sustainability, and we'll be joined by 3 different voices who are working in our state around these same issues. So we hope to see you there. Thank you for coming, and in the meantime, stay warm. Thanks, everybody.